We are about 4 weeks into Ukraine's counterattack, or whatever you want to call it. After more than a year and a half of waiting, Ukraine has begun recapturing some territory. Unsurprisingly, the information space is rife with opinions on how to interpret these matters. As such, today, we are going to get a better understanding of what is going on. This will be a 4-step process. We will begin with a quick rundown of the territorial changes that have occurred since the counteroffensive began. Then we will analyze 3 interpretations of these events: a Ukrainian failure, the start of a potential Ukrainian success, and the possibility that all of this is premature, and that the war would be better if it were not a spectator sport. But we begin by documenting the territorial changes. At the time of production, Ukraine has claimed the liberation of 9 villages along 3 vectors. They are all in between the Hook in the Dnipro River and Donetsk City, so instead of being grand war planners, let's zoom in on those locations. The majority of the successes have occurred along the border between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts, and lie within 2 smaller vectors. The remaining 2 are next to the bend in the river. It is worth noting that there are 2 cities with identical names near where the front lines begin to curve north. This has complicated reporting on the topic, but the subtle clues indicate that the original 2 are the right ones. Basically, this is a mini rant to complain about whoever thought it would be a good idea to use duplicate names. Though at least this is not like having 67 cities named Springfield in a country with only 50 states. Anyway, on the grand scheme of things, none of these villages is particularly valuable. The satellite shots make this apparent. For the smallest, I could not find any population figures, and the satellite photos only show a handful of buildings. The largest that I can find good information on has a population of 1,008 people. In sum, they collectively represent fewer than 3,000 people's pre-war homes. By comparison, we have previously discussed Russia's odd obsession with Bakhmut, but that had a population of over 70,000. The key difference, of course, is the quantity of resources poured into each. Hold that thought for a moment. Strategically, the Western momentum might be useful for Ukraine as a direct path to Melitopol, or to take a turn to the west and fight along the banks of the Dnipro, which would cover Ukraine's attack from one side. The eastern gains show promise as a way to drive to Mariupol or Berdyansk. Both are significant port cities, and either way it would cut off Russia's land bridge to Crimea. There are also some rumors that Ukraine is making progress on Bakhmut's flanks, but I do not want to focus on that until there is a clearer picture. The whole Wagner opera further complicated things there, as the Wagner troops that took over Rostov-on-Don, and the Russian loyalists that chased after them, departed from Donetsk, though Wagner was not an active part of the defensive operations, but maybe the loyalists were. Ukraine may have also established a beachhead south of the Dnipro opposite of Kherson City, despite the difficulties due to the breach of the Kakhovka Dam. That might sound weird, but we have discussed before how Russia's defensive strategy ought to take enough Russian bodies away from the area to make an operation there reasonable. Again, we will wait and see. So those are the territorial changes. What should we make of them? Square kilometers of land mean little without the context of the cost to acquire them. Those cost lines exist on the maps for a reason. And that takes us to the first possibility: that Ukraine's counterattack has failed. This was the narrative coming out of the Kremlin basically as soon as Ukraine started to maneuver troops. A June 9th acknowledgement that a counterattack was underway, but that it was ineffective. Then there was a parade of news articles indicating that Ukraine had lost 16 of its 109 Bradley fighting vehicles, a number that the Kremlin moved up to 18 during a recent Security Council meeting. And since then, there has been a slow trickle of other news reports regarding further Ukrainian equipment losses and casualties. Now, I do not want to say that those claims are factually wrong. The fog of war as it is, I do not know. The rest of us outsiders do not know, and even some insiders do not know either. But it is worth reminding the world that to make sense of what goes on in a war, we have to understand why the states are fighting and not negotiating. You know, the whole lines on maps thing. One of the main narratives for why the war is continuing is a disagreement over the West's commitment to Ukraine. Russia thinks that the West will cut and run, while the West, Ukraine included, thinks that the coalition will stay the course. That gets you minimum demands that are not compatible with one another. And if that is the case, then the entire reason that the war is being fought is to find out who is right and who is dead. Given that, if you are Russia, then you win by convincing Western observers that Ukraine is doomed to fail, which you might accomplish by broadcasting Ukrainian failures, real or perceived. So is the Bradley graveyard evidence of an inevitable Ukrainian defeat? Maybe. But I am not going to be updating my belief based on unverified government-affiliated accounts. I would take more stock in pro-Ukraine sources that claim high Ukrainian losses, but still with a grain of salt due to that whole fog of war thing. To be clear, this cuts both ways. Ukraine does not want the West to leave, so Kyiv's incentive is to stay upbeat publicly. As time passes, we will eventually start seeing accurate casualty reports, verified materiel losses, and perhaps some trustworthy leaks. Until then, I am withholding judgment. Now, some argue that the verified updates on territorial control are the evidence that the counterattack is a failure, that Ukraine allegedly spent all of those lives and materiel for a total population under 3,000. And Zelensky himself has described the counterattack as having progressed slower than desired. But funny enough, some similar premises lead others to draw the opposite conclusion. On that note, we move on to possibility number 2, that the counterattack is working. This starts with the same foundational point that Ukraine has recovered some land, but goes in the opposite direction. From this perspective, changes in territorial control are your tangible pieces of evidence that something is going Ukraine's way, with the caveat about what Ukraine may have lost in the process. By comparison, it is the biggest territorial exchange in the war for either side since November 2022's Kherson counteroffensive. The common objection here is within that phrasing, that things are not moving as fast as November, never mind the even faster September 2022 counterattack east of Kharkiv. However, the alleged lesson learned here is misleading for 2 reasons. First, this is not an accurate recollection of how the summer of 2022 unfolded. And second, it misunderstands how attacks on fortified positions work more generally. Let's start with the broader point. Throw back to D-Day, June 6, 1944, one of the most important days in the history of mankind. No counterattack is better known. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy at great cost and opened a Western front against the Axis. What is less well known is that the Allies promptly went, well, just about nowhere. Major changes of territory did not occur until the beginning of August. The Allies had breached the front line, but took a while to penetrate the next lines. But after that, it was open season. With the current war, the September and November advances generated headlines, but the results did not occur overnight. Early in the summer of 2022, Kyiv announced its intention to retake Kherson, apparently vulnerable because Russian troops rested precariously on the opposite side of the Dnipro River. The first efforts did not amount to much. American military advisors running the spreadsheets tried to convince Kyiv that the plan was not winnable. So instead, Ukraine used it as a fixing attack and shifted the real counteroffensive over to the northeast. Then, after a couple more months of hindering Russia's logistics, Ukraine could succeed in Kherson. We have discussed before how the signs point to Russia having a manpower shortage, and how it is hard to skimp on frontline soldiers under such conditions. But once the Ukrainian soldiers penetrate Russia's defensive lines, it will be very hard to stop them. And all of this is before taking into account whatever benefits will arise from the fallout of Prigozhin's mutiny. If the majority of Wagner troops refuse to sign Russian Ministry of Defense contracts, the numbers will look even worse for Russia. Even if Wagner was not taking part in defense, some portion will eventually have to fill whatever role they were playing. Thus, this interpretation is that everything is going as normal, if maybe a bit slow. Trust the process, Ukrainian style, as it were. The final possibility is that Ukraine is not really trying yet. That is, we are just observing probing attacks at the moment. Ukraine will take whatever Russia is willing to give, but Kyiv is not really betting any major chips on this at the moment. Instead, the Ukrainian army is examining which table it wants to play at. Consistent with this, reports indicate that Ukraine has not yet committed 3/4 of the troops that it formed for the counteroffensive. Indeed, Putin concluded a recent Security Council meeting by saying that Ukraine's offensive potential has not been exhausted, and that there still may be reserves available. Such caution from the Kremlin would make sense. Trying to break through a defender's front lines is a costly endeavor. On D-Day, the Allies suffered more than 10,000 casualties, including 4,414 dead, and lost 185 M4 Sherman tanks. And mind you, that was a success. Think about what those numbers would have looked like had the operation failed. Ukraine basically only gets one serious opportunity at this for the year. If it turns into a disaster, Ukraine will have to wait to train another batch of soldiers. But then the calendar hits the rainy season, causing the roads to muddy up. Then winter and snow, and then we go back to more rain and mud. And now suddenly we are looking at May 2024 before the weather is pleasant again. That being the case, it is better that Ukraine takes a deliberate approach to its probing phase. Better to lose a few soldiers and some materiel testing the waters, than commit yourself to a disastrous vector and lose your entire army. The perverse trade-off here is that, to the extent that slow developing attacks create more skeptics in the West, Ukraine is pushed to take greater risks than it would want to in the aggregate, which could pay off, but could also backfire spectacularly. Part of this seems to be media-made. That we live in a world with high-speed internet, smartphones, and an endless supply of cameras mounted on drones. And all of this has turned war into a spectator sport, akin to a first-person shooter. And sure, some of this criticism is valid, but it is also the type of thing said about every war. The Gulf War, for example, got the same treatment because it was the first conflict in the era of 24/7 cable news. However, for some perspective, things are not nearly as bad as they were during the American Civil War. Imagine a time when Union civilians, including many senators, traveled south from Washington, D.C. to watch the First Battle of Bull Run. Yeah, they actually did that in person. I do not think anyone is going to be replicating that today. Still, this is not the incentive structure that the West wants to create. The better alternative? Let Kyiv cook, as it were. Personally, I am cooking up a couple of new book projects, but until those are done, check out this one on the causes of Russia's invasion. The video description has the details. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Minor update regarding the Wagner opera. Recall that Prigozhin's main claim is that he wanted to remove Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov from the war effort. Shoigu has now been seen in public with Putin. However, Gerasimov has not, or at least not at the time that I say this. Who knows what is going to be true 5 minutes from now? Anyway, this is leading a lot of people to ask, where's Gerasimov? Huh. Did someone just say hashtag wheresgerasimov?